Today on the Mr. Maple Show, we discuss heat-tolerant Japanese maples. We give some of our top tips for growing Japanese maples in high heat zones. We also give some of our top picks for Japanese maples for hot areas. Hey guys, welcome to the Mr. Maple Show. I'm Matt Nichols. I've got the Oklahoma Brian Rulin here today. Had to bring Brian in the studio for the heat tolerant discussion.
Yeah, man, I'm excited to be here. You know, this is a great opportunity to get on here and just talk about maples. It's one of my favorite things to do, and I haven't got to really sit in on a good podcast yet, so I'm excited about that. And you know, it's something we're really passionate about, bringing this show every Sunday on our podcast, and it's been pretty awesome.
Guys, we love providing you with a Japanese maple talk show. This is going to be on all major podcast platforms, so definitely go and subscribe to us on Spotify, Pandora, iTunes. Rate us 5 stars on any of those platforms. That goes a long way. But also, we really appreciate everybody jumping in those chats. I mean, these air on our YouTube channel on Sunday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern. And gosh, it's just becoming so much fun. I know me and Brian get in there a good bit.
Yeah, you know, it's really cool what we've kind of started to create this community. You know, I feel like ever since I've gotten into maples, I've met so many amazing people, and you know, it has this element of community to it. You know, and we all kind of connect it with plants, and this is a perfect way to just sit back and just have these discussions about our favorite things, which is plants in general, and then especially Japanese maples. So
Brian always made a mark on me of something you said to me, even coming from the customer side of it before you worked here. You said, well, Mr. Maple always gives you a little bit more.
That's right.
So
That's right.
He's like, we need to do a little bit more. And so that's what we like to do. And I think that live chat's, you know, it's becoming a community that we really, I look forward to it. And I think it's something fun. It's something a little bit more with the video even. It's like something extra on top of it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So guys, today we're going to be talking about heat-tolerant Japanese maples. We're also going to be discussing tips for giving you the best success in high heat zones with Japanese maples. Now, we typically list Japanese maples as plants that are going to work zones 5 through 9. But as you've heard me explain, zones aren't always the best indicator for heat tolerance. So Japanese maples work zones 5 through 9, but zones are really based on how cold plants get. So it's a little misnomer for some places. We still love to use that because it's a USDA zone, you know, rating. And so it's been zone verified by the USDA for one, but also it gives you a very good East Coast explanation. So as far as the East Coast goes, 5 through 9 is almost a perfect analogy for kind of the high end and low end of what maples can do.
Yeah, you know, there's so many different climates that we're all trying to grow our favorite plants in. And so, you know, understanding the zones and kind of just learning more and more about that, your specific climate, I think is so important. I mean, I remember I'd tell people, you know, I'm growing Japanese maples in Oklahoma, and they're like, wow, are you crazy? You know, like, but I mean, there's so many climates that you can grow them in, and you know, outside of just what you would normally think of.
Oh, for sure. I mean, Japanese maples are such a diverse group, and they're extremely durable plants. I was really, we recently had the Maple Society meeting, and I was really impressed with Jake Grossman's presentation. He is an ecologist, an assistant professor of biology and environmental studies at Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota, and he spoke really about Japanese maples, but maples in general, and their ability to be adaptive plants. And it was interesting because he spoke a lot to kind of if the climate even becomes warmer, Japanese maples are a plant, and maples in general are a plant that are going to survive that heat increase because they're very, very durable plants, and they're plants that tend to adapt a great deal to the zones they're in. So plants that become exposed to hotter zones then work even hotter as they become more heat tolerant. But I thought that was really interesting. Getting into a little bit more of that, we did have some customers who did some extremes. So I've had some customers who have kind of pushed things even a little further than Oklahoma over the years. So that West Coast can be a little trickier for the zone ratings. Again, the 5 through 9 is perfect for the East Coast, but I always like to let people know that it can get a little more area determinative, and especially humidity and heat index can certainly be factors, especially on the West Coast, like Phoenix, New
Yeah.
Mexico, California. I know customers who are in Zone 8, Phoenix, who may have a harder time growing a tree than a customer in Zone 10, California. It's just an interesting dynamic there.
Yeah, I think it's there's so many things to take into consideration when you're thinking about growing Japanese maples, and I always kind of one of those things that I always thought about was is you have to almost be kind of fearless with
Hmm.
it, and not be afraid to be kind of a zone pusher.
Right.
Like I mean, sometimes you get so caught up on according to this is the only place this can grow, and obviously there are those guidelines that you want to follow, but like you said, they're extremely adaptive. So they can be in certain areas that, a lot of people would say, man, I've got this plant and it's thriving here. And you're like, wow, I wouldn't have expected that. And
Right.
so a lot of times, it's not as rigid as you really think that it is.
Douglas Justice had the best quote ever about this. When we interviewed Douglas, I thought, he was just one of the most interesting guys. Definitely check out our Douglas Justice
Yeah.
podcast. It's doing really well on all audio platforms.
Yeah.
But he had a great quote about this. He said, plants don't necessarily read books.
That's right.
I'm like, yeah, that's perfect. And so the maples don't necessarily read all the literature on where they need to be sometimes. And it makes a great example for don't be afraid to push it. Don't be afraid to try things in higher zones. I mean, I've grown plants here that I necessarily couldn't grow in zone 6B here
Right.
and had pretty good success.
Yeah.
So, don't be afraid to get outside of your comfort zone. As far as somebody said, this only works up to zone 9. Don't be afraid to try it. It might
Right.
be different in your climate. I always like to shout out maple collector Aaron Dragseth here too, and
Yeah.
kind of use him as an example. He's in zone 10, California. Again, he doesn't get too extremely hot or too extremely cold, and he's able to grow several Japanese maples even in higher sunlights than you might expect being in a zone 10 California.
Right. Yeah, and then you got to take into consideration too microclimates. And I mean,
Mhm.
everybody's garden is a little bit different in where you're at, what your altitude. I mean, you could get into so many
Right.
variables on that of where you're at and how your climate is going to affect the plants that you plant in your garden. So, I mean, there's a lot of variables to it, but I think it's really cool that the science behind a lot of that. Talking to Jake and Douglas, I mean, they were just super interesting people, and to hear their kind of analysis of plants and that on that scientific realm.
Oh, it was super fascinating. That's one of the reasons I love those meetings. You can kind of pick people's brain. Uh, I've had customers that have taken maples beyond that a little bit. So I've had customers who are, these are the extremes. So most of the people we're talking to here are probably going to be growing it in a zone 7 or 8 and going, wow, it's so hot here.
Right.
And it may be, don't be wrong, but those are areas you definitely can grow Japanese maples. I've had customers that have taken it kind of to the max extreme. So I had a customer, Mr. Diaz, who was growing Japanese maples in Miami, and he had quite the collection for a little while. It is trickier in that kind of zone. I definitely don't recommend it because it is going to be a little bit more challenging. Japanese maples do require a dormancy. So if you're in a zone that doesn't allow for that dormancy period, it's like growing them indoors. Eventually, they're going to need to drop leaf. So, what tends to happen in, say, like a Miami type setting, are Japanese maples that even performed. Like he had a fire glow that looked great for like 5 years,
Right.
and it was remarkable. Like we were just keeping track. We would call them and be like, "Hey, I'm still very very interested in like how your fire glow is doing and like what's going on." And so we kind of suggested some of our most heat tolerant things for him to begin with, and he said, I know I'm an outlier here, but I want to try." And we respect the try there always. What tends to happen is a forced dormancy. So not even necessarily in the fall times, but for him, a lot of times it might even be April, and they're already pretty warm in Miami in April, right? Way ahead of us. The tree would just go, okay, time to go dormant because it'd been leaf all winter,
Right.
and there's no real winter, so it kind of kept dormancy. It kind of kept its foliage the entire time. And so in some of those hotter zones, what happens is a false dormancy. So the tree just randomly drops a bunch of leaves. And if it doesn't do that, what you end up is kind of uglier foliage because they do require that dormancy period. It's one of the reasons they don't work great inside. So you do have to be somewhere where dormancy is achieved. I actually have customers in Hawaii that buy. We shipped several trees to
Yeah,
Hawaii since we've been
absolutely.
here.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, in Maui, there's some elevation changes where you can get up high enough to actually be growing Japanese maples pretty successfully in Hawaii. But keep in mind that dormancy is, I would say, one of the main factors for if you can't achieve dormancy in your area, it may not work for a Japanese maple.
Yeah, there's so many aspects to it. I was thinking that a lot of times in a lot of those higher heat areas, one of the most important things is to think about what kind of maple you're going to try to grow there.
Mhm.
I mean that makes a huge difference whether you're picking uh, between cultivars or even species of what you're going to be more successful with. I mean, there's so many that you can pick from, so it's hard sometimes to think oh man, I don't know if I'm going to be able to grow in my area. But if you look into some of these different cultivars, different species, you can really start to feel more confident about growing in higher heat.
See, this is why I got the Oklahomian here on the podcast today. You guys are going to be like, Western North Carolina, you guys got it easy. Y'all are zone 6. Rainfall's not a factor for y'all. You've got it all made. And it is an easy area to grow Japanese maples for sure. We're at, but I got Brian here.
Yeah.
He's suffered the extremes there in Oklahoma.
Oh man,
and he's ready. We're going to go into some different tips for growing Japanese maples in higher heat climates, and hopefully this will give you a little bit more confidence, but also a little bit more success on some of those fringe areas where you may be a little bit more high heat. Now, again, we list these as 5 through 9, and that's a generalization. Typically, in your zone 9 environment, most Japanese maples are going to require some late day shade. So that's first and foremost. If you're in a heavy, high heat, extreme
yeah,
heat exposure, you're probably going to, the more shade, the better.
definitely. And it's been exciting coming to this new climate out here and in this beautiful 6B here in the mountains.
Got you spoiled now.
I'm all spoiled with it now, but I learned so much in my garden in Oklahoma, and I think that's one of the important things to remember as a gardener is that you learn from experience. I mean,
Mhm.
all of this information that we have come from experience, from
Yeah.
people who tried these things and grew these things over the years, and all of that comes from experience. So, as a gardener, you have to kind of take that responsibility and say, okay, I'm going to learn what I can learn from this and try new things. And growing in Oklahoma was a challenge for sure. We had very long periods of drought, very high heat, humidity there, and all of the extreme weather changes you can think of. I mean,
I've seen some of your hail that you were getting out there. That's probably the scariest part for me.
yeah, ice storms. I mean, all kinds of
I,
crazy
I remember
stuff
you
there.
posted on Facebook the tornado alarms.
Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh.
So it was a challenge for sure, but it taught me so much about maples and how to approach it. And there's so many different things, especially when you're growing like in a full sun situation and in a high heat area. You know, as in Oklahoma, we had a lot of winds there as well, so things would dry up really fast.
Hmm.
And then the ground temperature would heat up so much from the sun. And so, one of the most important things that I would give as a huge key to growing in high heat areas is mulching,
Yeah.
because it controls the ground temperature,
Hmm.
it controls the moisture evaporation from that as well. I mean, it just plays a huge role in, especially with a young plant too. I mean, something that gets more established, it's not as crucial. But in those younger years of the plant as well, like say you get a 1 gallon from Mr. Maple, you plant it in your yard, and you're in a full sun situation, a high heat area.
Hmm.
I mean, mulch is going to be what is the difference between that plant making it and not,
Oh,
or thriving and not. You know
oh
what I mean?
yeah, 100% agree. I definitely recommend mulch in high heat areas. It's one of the very best keys to success there. I'll piggyback on that and saying not planting your plants too deep
Yeah.
is also super important. That's important in all areas, but especially in high heat areas because that root ball needs to get some air to it, and you're
Sure.
gonna not plant it too deep, and then not creating the volcano of death with
Yeah.
the
We
mulch.
don't want to do that.
You,
Yeah.
you'll
Yeah.
see that sometimes. But yeah, mulch is going to increase the coolness. It's going to break down the soils underneath. It's going to allow the soil to be naturally conditioned. So even just lightly mulching an area has been proven to increase the nutritional value to the tree long term. But the benefits for coolness are paramount. I mean, they really can't be understated here. Mulch, especially in high heat zones, is going to give you one of your very best success rates you can have. Now, I tend to not make sure to cover the graft. That's one of the things I
Yeah.
always want to stress whenever we're talking about Japanese maples. If you bury that graft, you'll create a situation where the tree has to reroot. So I like to leave a little bit of exposure around the base of my plant when mulching, and not cover the actual root ball too highly. But mulching around that area, it's going to hold moisture in. It's gonna alleviate so many other problems.
Yeah, for sure. And that's the thing, and you'll learn over time, of the best application of that. But you're right. I mean, you want to keep that away from the base of that trunk. And you don't want to create that volcano. You see that in landscape everywhere, and it
Oh
just
my
drives me
gosh,
nuts. It's like
what university's still teaching this? Because it's all the professionals that do it.
I mean, it takes everything I have not to go up and just start pulling it. Like, and I'm like, I don't work there. I don't, it's like, I just want to go up and save the tree from, ultimate death. But it's, mulch is definitely going to be your friend in the high heat areas. And, another thing that I thought I'd jump into is, one of the things that I learned early on is to not be too quick to decide where you're going to plant
Mm,
your cultivar.
yeah.
And so, uh, we all want to just hurry up and get it to ground and get it
Mhm.
going. But sometimes the best way to learn what that particular cultivar is going to be able to handle in your area is to start it in a container. You can move that around and play with its sun and where it's going to be in the garden and find its kind of happy place. And then decide, okay, I really like the way that looks there. It seems to be handling the heat fine there, the sun ratio there, and then you can decide to plant it in
Oh, I
that
think
spot.
that's great advice. A few factors to think about in the container, and we'll get into a little bit more of this too. But to piggyback on what you're saying there, and I think that's perfect advice for some of these higher heat areas. Be conscious of your container
Yep.
and the amount of heat your container has as well.
Absolutely.
So, while Japanese maple might do fine in the ground, it might be a little less heat resistant in the pot
Very true.
for other factors. Especially what we tend to see is like late summer, people in containers will go away for a week and they'll come back and say, "Oh no, my tree's dead." And it's not really dead, but it's dried out quicker than they were used to.
Right.
And so, size of root ball as the tree expands, things like that can be factors. But that's a great way to kind of figure out what spots work best. A thing I'd love to throw out here under my tips section is not over fertilizing.
Yeah.
So don't go too extreme with your fertilizers. We have a whole How to Grow Japanese Maple podcast, so we won't rehash every single thing we talked about there. But these things are as important for cold climates as they are as very high heat climates. The rate at which your tree's grown really determines the quality of your tree.
For sure.
And so if your tree is overgrown, it's going to take up energy less efficiently. It's going to have more issues if it's been over fertilized. If the tree's been over pushed, it's going to have a harder time during some of those summer peak heat times to feed the rest of the plant. That cambium is going to be a little overstretched, and you're not going to have as easy of a transfer of energy throughout your plant. Like if it's growing at a more moderate pace, your tree's just going to be more successful at protecting itself from some of those extreme changes.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's always a reason to be, conservative in your approach to plants. I think it's always led to more, success for me when I was growing. And, just to kind of keep rolling on with what we're talking about here, I think, you know, the big question, we've talked about this a lot, especially on our channel, is
Mhm.
is watering Japanese maples. And I think when you get into these high heat areas, everybody says, "Well, how often should I water my Japanese maple?" It's like,
It's a one
well,
set answer.
I mean, gosh, like what time of year is it? Like especially for me in Oklahoma, I mean, you'd be probably amazed at how much I watered during the summer months when we had those drought come through. And I mean, sometimes the ground would get so dry it would literally crack.
Oh
I mean, you could
gosh.
like fit your hand down inside the crack of the ground. I had very well draining soil, but some of those droughts, I had to be out there very consistently watering. And so I think it's
Mhm.
really important to, if you're going to plant in a high heat area, you're probably going to have to water that particular maple more than you're going to have in one that's in a shady location.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Those high heat areas are going to be more adept at taking up water. Your tree's going to need that to cool it off. It's going to need that because that heat, that increased heat, is increasing the growth rate. So that tree's going to need that water to help sustain its new growth. Definitely, we always beat this like a dead horse here at our nursery, but drainage is so important.
Yeah.
Bacteria is going to set up faster in warm, damp areas. So you want to make sure that you're
Right.
not creating a standing water area in your higher heat zones. If your area is, especially in one of those warmer climates, I mean, you definitely can't have them having poor drainage because it's just going to be bacteria filled around your plant. You're going to have more, bacterial issues. You're going to have more drainage issues. You're going to have more root rot a lot faster if it's warm and wet.
For sure. And I think that kind of applies to also, a lot of people like to use watering systems,
Hmm.
and and you're basically saying, okay, every plant in this general area needs the same amount of water, because I mean it's so important to realize, depending on where you've got that planted, how much sun it gets, it's going to vary between plant to plant of how much water you apply to it. And so in high heat areas, I think that's such an important thing to realize is, when you think about how much do I need to water? Well, it depends. It depends on where you have this plant. And if you have it out in a high heat area, you're going to have to address that more consistently than something else that doesn't get that high heat all day.
Oh, I think that's so important. A big factor there, good drainage, but also airflow. So
Hmm.
especially in the South, a lot of our customers are even further south than us, and they're going to be in climates that are conducive to Japanese maples, but airflow may be even more important in some of those high humidity areas. So areas where the Japanese maple's not getting too stagnant, areas where where you're too condensed or you're not getting any airflow, those are areas that are going to be more likely to have like powdery mildew issues and high heat, things like that. So if you can get some airflow or placing your Japanese maple, and that goes back to what he was saying about in the container, you can kind of play around with the spot a little bit. But if you can have an area that has decent airflow when you're selecting a spot for your maple in some of the higher heat zones, and you certainly don't want 60-mile-an-hour winds on your plant, but if you can have it in an area where that tree is going to have a good amount of just airflow, not an area that's stagnant or kind of holding too much humidity.
Yeah, and I think there's a fine line to between balancing of how long you give a tree to get established as well. A lot of times when they're a younger plant, they don't seem to tolerate the heat quite as well. They've got a smaller root system, so they're not able to absorb water as much as they probably need in
Hmm.
that situation. The more established they get, the better off they are in those high heat situations. But then you also have to kind of overcome the fear of thinking about moving plants.
Right.
Like I used to get in that place. I was like, oh, once I put it in this spot, I felt like I just couldn't move it anymore. I didn't want to worry about. But I learned over time, you definitely want to give yourself the freedom to say, you've had this here for a couple of years. You're like, man, this thing is just not working out here. It's struggling. Obviously I'm having airflow issues, or I'm
Right.
having, severe sun scald on that. I need to move this plant somewhere else. Don't be afraid to wait till it goes dormant. The best time of the year when it's dormant, and move that plant to a new location. I mean, I think sometimes as a gardener, you kind of create these little fears of like, I'm going to disturb this thing too
Right.
much or whatever. But I've learned over the years, I mean, again, they're so adaptable
Hmm.
and such a hardy plant that they can be moved fairly regularly, and to find a spot where you need to put them.
Yeah, I mean that's so important, and you can kind of play around with a little bit. There's different microclimates even within our own yard
Right.
where a little bit of late day shade may make a huge difference for that cultivar.
Yeah.
Definitely surrounding plants can be a major factor. So if you can provide a tree, everybody says I can't talk, early morning sun, late day shade are important, and so all of our plants go in that one spot in the yard that
Right.
gets the
Yeah.
early morning sun, late day shade. Those southwest exposures are always going to be our highest heat areas. And so, as gardeners, we're always looking for our premium plant to be in that early morning sun, late
That's
day
right.
shade, that one spot that's perfect, right? And so, I'm going to find one day I'm going to buy a house that has all early morning sun, late
That's
day
right.
shade on the whole yard.
I mean, I wish we could get a percentage of people who actually have that type of light. I mean, probably pretty low. Most of us we're working with what we got, and we don't always have the ideal
Right.
sun to shade ratio. So it's kind of a constant, like you said, everything gets crammed in this little section. Like this is where everything's going to go. But I kind of separated my garden up in that way. I would look at different cultivars and I'd study on those and figure out, okay, I have an area in my garden where I considered my sun garden, and then
Hmm.
I had an area where I considered my shade garden. And so I would always try to make sure I did the research on each cultivar that I was planting to figure out, where in my yard this plant's going to work best.
And other plants in your yard can be a major factor for that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the perfect time of the day, but a larger, more sun tolerant tree providing some midday relief for some of these cultivars in higher heat zones may make the world of difference toward how it
Absolutely.
looks.
Yeah.
Other plants in your landscape are a huge factor. You can maybe plant a Chinese fringe tree or in some areas even a bald cypress, and the plant might not necessarily need to be exactly underneath this tree to be benefiting from some of the late day shade that plant throws to it.
Absolutely.
Another thing I'd like to throw out there about other plants, it goes into your mulch category a little bit, especially in containers, but sedums and small ground covers that don't give a huge amount of root competition are great factors for kind of the mulch category as well, because you can use sedums to kind of keep a root ball a little bit cooler, hold a little bit more moisture in some of your higher heat areas, but you're not necessarily giving it huge root. Now, be conscious that you don't want to put a grass out that's going to give it a huge amount
Right.
of root competition, but there's certainly plants we can place around our Japanese maples to increase their heat tolerance.
So I think this is a great time to kind of dive into like some of our favorite maples, right? I mean, that's what we always just are waiting to talk about
Right.
is to get into the cultivars. I'm such a collector at heart. I mean, that's why I came out here. You know, you guys welcomed me with open arms as a gardener, as a collector, and it's been really cool to. I mean, there's so many cultivars I don't even have yet or haven't heard of. I'm learning so much out here. It's been really awesome to get in here and
Oh
be a
man,
part of this with you guys.
your enthusiasm's infectious. Like if we're not already crazy enough about maples, now we're even pushed further. So how many maples were you growing in the Oklahoma garden out
Oh man, you know, the number would always vary a little bit, but I would say confidently that I stayed pretty close to that 250 different cultivars there in my garden in Oklahoma, which
So here's the real question: have we passed that yet?
well, you know, here in North Carolina, I'm kind of working on a smaller scale garden, so I'm learning to really get into the more dwarfs. And, you know what I mean? Like
Right, right.
I'm adapting to my surroundings, which is an awesome thing. And you know, it's kind of a dangerous thing to have this access to so many Japanese maples. But you know, I think you probably expected it, and my wife
Oh,
certainly did.
sure.
You know, she's never surprised when I come home with another load of Japanese
Oh,
maple trees.
I remember the days where she would call me and say, "I have a special request." I think she's got the bug as much as you. A lot of times, Frances is awesome, but she would call me and say, "I know Brian's got a box coming, but how many more can I add to that box and surprise him?"
Yeah,
So I don't think you got any worries there about getting in trouble bringing maples home. That
yeah,
might be.
she's absolutely very supportive of what I'm passionate about, and she's been a big part of that. And you know, we really enjoy gardening together and planting. I think it's just a great way to bond and a great like therapeutic thing for me just to
Oh
get out
yeah.
there and get my hands in the dirt. So
Yeah, so we wanted to bring you in especially for this cultivar discussion because we talked about Brian's experience growing there in Oklahoma, and we've kind of broke down some lists. Now, again, I'm in Zone 6B here in Western North Carolina, so many of you may go like, "What is I gonna know about heat tolerance stuff?" But we have customers all over the United States. I've shipped Japanese maples to all 50 states, believe it or not. And oddly enough, they end up in other places. Like I don't ship trees to
right,
other countries,
yeah,
but I'll look on Facebook and I'll see a picture of my label and somebody will have taken it. And against my knowledge,
right,
it'll show up in like South Korea or
yeah.
something. You're like, holy cow, that's a Dragon Master with my label on it in South Korea.
I mean, you're
But
worldwide, man.
I guess so. But so we have definitely experienced Japanese maples in all these different areas, and we've also sought to go and study them. So not only have we kind of based some of this list off some of our customer experience,
Right.
but some of our own personal experience of like going and checking out what's doing the best in some of the extreme zones. But we'd like
Absolutely.
to talk about some different categories here for you. Um, and these are the definitive picks. So if it's not on this list, it doesn't work.
Right. Yeah.
No, it already triggered like every gardener ever.
Right.
But we're just giving you some of our top suggestions. So we actually have a heat seekers collection that we do that's Acer Livierum, and we also have several videos on YouTube about our top picks for high heat areas, and some of that'll overlap with this a little
Right.
bit. But the way we broke it down this time is by like categories. So we'll talk about some of our top 5 red uprights. And again, this isn't a definitive list. There's tons more red uprights that can do great in high heat zones. But these were some of mine and Brian's favorite ones
Absolutely.
for kind of pushing it a little bit.
Right. And I think that's so cool that we have this podcast to bring kind of this discussion. I mean, I remember early on when I was getting into to maples, I would have loved to just sit back and listen to a podcast about, hey, here's some great plants for your particular area. These are going to do well in your high heat. So information is always key, and for success in gardening. And so I think it's cool that we can sit back and have this discussion, because I think there's a lot of people out there, especially, I mean, there's so many cultivars now. You get
Yeah.
on you get on MrMaple.com and you're like, man, where do I begin? Right. And so this maybe can help start that process, because I know a lot of times it can be overwhelming, especially when you're first getting started. Like, man, I don't really know where to begin. Well, maybe these groups and this list here can kind of help some of these people who are in these high heat areas that are not sure, and they don't want to spend money on something that's not going to do
Right.
well, and so they're cautious about that. And this is a great way to give them that information.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I think if you're getting a Japanese maple, it's a prominent tree in your yard, whether you have one or you have 100.
Yeah,
I mean, it's an important plant too. You're
absolutely.
investing in an interesting plant, and you want it to do well and succeed. And so these are some of our top choices for high heat. Now that does translate some as well to sun tolerance, but we'll talk a little bit about that with each of these. As far as red uprights go, I've got a lot of favorites. I guess we'll start at the fives and work our way up.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it that way. So I listed in my number five here, Acer Palmatum Summer Sunset. Now this is one we haven't offered in a little while. We should probably get it back on our list more. Whenever I hang out with Dr. Durr, he always runs up and puts me on the spot and says, "Name the best red for full sun in Texas," like it's in zone 10 or so,
Right.
so extreme. And so he always has that question in the back of his mind. Like he's always looking for the very pinnacle one.
Right.
Summer Sunset's an excellent upright red. It was an introduction by Paul Lowe, so the same guy that named Sherwood Elfin, and he's down in central Alabama. And I found it to be a very good performer for holding that red extremely late.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. That's one I actually hadn't ever grown before, and learning about that, it sounds like a great plant.
It's definitely one we're going to have to get back on Mr. Maple more. It's one we've offered in the past for sure. It might not even be on our new website, so I'll probably have to get a landing page for that after this
Yeah.
podcast. But it's definitely on that upper scale for sun tolerance. And with the reds, really what we're looking for is in those high heat zones what
Yeah.
looks good, right? What's
Right.
like Tom Cox said, what looks good in the fall. So
Yeah.
what's looking good after all this brutal attack of summer
Yeah,
and
no doubt. Yeah, I loved how he explained that. A good plant, every plant can look really nice in the spring when it first leaves out. And
right,
you're like, wow, look at this, but then, summer comes and it gets a little beat up and tattered, and going into fall, you may not have much foliage left, for a fall. But so jumping right into next, I mean, talk about a fall plant. I mean, fire glow. I mean, this thing just absolutely lights up in the fall. I mean, just glows out there. I mean, I love those bright reds, because it makes everything else stand out around it. And Acer Palmatum Fire Glow is no exception to
I mean,
that.
there's a reason why we always try to keep this one in stock.
Right.
It's always at the top of the list for color in any zone, but it's also one of those top performers for that mid-sized tree in high heat areas. So if you're looking for a mid-sized tree, you don't want something that's going to quite reach the blood good kind of sizes. Grow at a little bit smaller pace, but provide you with exceptional heat tolerance and exceptional fiery red fall color. Fire Glow's, it's an awesome choice. It's an introduction actually from Italy, but I've seen Fire Glow perform excellently in Texas in some high heat exposures, and for that reason alone, it's always on my list as a top candidate for high heat plants.
Absolutely. So what's your number three there, Matt?
All right, so moving along, we've got Twombly's Red Sentinel. Now, this is a little bit more narrow of a selection. I do find that brooms in general tend to be a little bit more heat tolerant. So, not always a gained characteristic of finding a broom on a tree. Twombly's Red Sentinel is a tall columnar plant. So, it's not going to be super tall, but it's not your typical broom. It's not a 5x5 ball. This one's going to be 10 to 12 feet tall and 5 to 6 feet wide, make more of that columnar platform there in the landscape. Twombly's is always a top performer for us in high heat areas, though. I mean, it's got everything you want for color, texture, columnar shape, but also high heat. This one's going to go into full sun even in the zone 8. Most zone 8s are going to be able to grow this in zone 8B in high heat exposures, late day sun, and retain a lot of that color late in the season. Anything can get a little green before the fall color,
Right.
but
Yeah.
retain that color really late into the year.
Yeah, that's definitely a great cultivar for that. I grew that one in Oklahoma as well. I had the front yard didn't have much shade at all, so I was always kind of trying to find ones that I could put out there, and and it accented great against. We had kind of a light tan color brick on the house, so that bold red right there and by the house just looked amazing. I wanted something that would just kind of give that nice shape and form out front. So great choice on that. And then the next one on the list here, it always cracks me up because when I first came out here to meet Matt and Tim many years ago, I guess that's maybe 2, 3 years ago now.
Back when you were just accused for working for us.
That's right. Yeah. Everybody say you're working for Mr.
I
Maple.
know it.
Like secretly, I was not, but now here I am.
Well,
So
you had the fastest fingers in the West
I did.
on the 101 sale. So really, the reason you would get accused for it is because Brian would win the 101 sales
Yeah.
when they would go hourly new plants listing, and so people would be more annoyed that you were getting the first one of something that magic moon went off, and they said, "I know that guy's working for you. I see him post about you."
Oh man, but yeah, so they caught me off guard. Said, "Hey, you want to be in a video?" I'm like, sure, yeah, I'll do that." And so the first video I ever was on was Hefner's Red, which is one of my favorite red uprights. I grew this in Oklahoma. It's just a beautiful plant. I really like how it holds its red color very well. One of my favorites in that nature. It just seemed to really hold that presence out there, especially in sun. And great cultivar.
Oh, it's a super high heat performer. Hefner's Nursery is actually a nursery here in North Carolina, and I actually talked to them a little bit about this tree getting selected one time, and they told me basically it was an old seed catalog that the grandparent had ordered from,
Oh wow.
and they had a whole bunch of seeds, and they'd grown them in like a seed tray, but they hadn't gotten them potted up, and it was late into the summer when they were actually going to pot these up, and that red seedling that became Hefner's Red was still like peak color,
Right.
and everything else in that whole seed set had greened up, and they were like, "What is this? This is special." And so they grafted that one and got it out there in the trade under the name Hefner's Red. Excellent plant. I mean, it's always at that paramount for anybody growing in Texas or higher heat zones that are going to have a high humidity. It's excellent at holding its color, maybe the best, if not one of the best,
Yeah.
for retaining that color late into the season in high heat zones.
Sure.
One thing I always let people know, it tends to be very multi-stemmed.
Yeah.
So it does tend to be more of a full round canopy and multi-trunked. Not multi-trunked at the base, but multi-stemmed going up from that trunk.
Yeah.
But excellent plant and great red fall color on that one too.
Absolutely.
So next up here, I've got my number one choice for upright reds, and that is Emperor One. Now, Hefner's Red and Emperor One could maybe almost be interchangeable on this list. They're both high heat trees. When I'm shipping a Japanese maple to Dallas and somebody says, "Hey, I'd like a blood good," I tend to call them and say, "Hey, have you considered an Emperor One?" Emperor One's a selection from Red Maple Nurseries. We did a whole deep dive on them on our YouTube channel. You have to check that out. It's a classic Japanese maple nursery. Dick Wolf there introduced so many great plants. And Emperor One's probably one of his crowning achievements. I mean, it was a great plant. It's the same plant as Red Emperor, if you've ever seen that in the trade. They're actually the same plant typically as they are in the trade. But Emperor One, for all around structure, foliage, growth, and heat tolerance, it's a very hard tree to beat. It's got your classic upright Japanese maple tree form. Gets out there a little bit faster in blood good at maybe a foot to a foot and a half of growth a year, but super durable for.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of covers all the bases, right? I mean, it's what you think of when you think of that traditional upright red Japanese maple, and very heat tolerant as well. It even leaves out a little bit later, so you can kind of prevent some of those early or late frost damages that you have. I had that in Oklahoma, so that was one of the benefits I liked about it as well as it being heat tolerant. I thought that was a interesting feature on that. But yeah, I mean, it's just a great upright red, and I think you're right. I mean, if somebody said I need your best heat tolerant, number one choice. Right. I mean, it's hard to not bring up Emperor One.
It's always at the top of the list for good reason. It's kind of got a little bit of a glossy sheen on it, which I like. And I actually like if you have it out in a heavy sun area, it kind of gets a green silvery undertone underneath the leaf. So when it's blowing in the wind, you kind of get that little green splash every now and then under that dark red. Excellent red fall color. And I mean, it's hard to beat it for an overall upright red. I mean, if you're going to be even in a zone 6 or 7 and you're looking for a full sun upright Japanese maple, it's going to perform extremely well for you in your sunnier spot.
Yeah, and I guess from there, I mean, we might as well just jump right into the next group here. Let's talk about some green uprights.
Yeah, so we kind of broke down some of our favorite green uprights. Again, I'll start at 5 and go up. Gosh, we could change a lot of trees
Yeah,
out here in this category.
right.
Like, I will say that a lot of the green uprights are exceptionally heat
Sure.
tolerant. These are some of our favorites. I actually listed at 5 Sukasa Silhouette. Again, another columnar one, so I like to get some different traits in here for you. It's one from Sukasa Maple Nursery there in Japan. I've got to go and visit them before. Really kind folks there and really generous with their time with us. Sukasa Silhouette is a columnar tree, especially if you keep a good central leader and you keep it in the sun. If you get a multi-stem tree and you don't prune it to be more single stem when it's young, they can get a little bit wider.
Right.
But if you're keeping that as a single stem tree and you're growing it in more sunlight, so it's not having to go in search of the sun, it's going to be extremely narrow. I mean, if you're growing that one in sun, fast grower, whatever, 1.5 foot of growth a year, but you're going to keep it way more compact and dense.
Yeah, it's such a great such a great tree. I was really intrigued when we went down to Hendersonville on Maple Street down there,
Right.
and here's a Sukasa Silhouette growing as a street tree,
Uh,
next to the sidewalk in
You
full
know it's tough
sun.
as hell if it's in
I
the
mean,
in the street tree category.
I was just totally taken by that. I mean, I think that just gives the perfect example of how heat tolerant this tree is, how hardy it is. I mean, it's not out on a drip system or, what I mean,
Right.
it's out there just doing its thing, and it's makes a great presence too. I love that columnar shape to it. And so next on the list, we've got another great heat tolerant with some bark feature, Baton Rouge.
Yeah, we could have put a lot of the coral barks in
Yeah,
here. I mean,
I
they're
mean,
pretty heat tolerant in general. Most of the coral bark, Sengukaku was exceptionally
for sure.
durable. We went with the most extreme version of that, which is the Baton Rouge. So Baton Rouge was actually selected in Warren, Texas, by Doremus Nursery, and they're like 30 minutes above Houston. And so I drove all the way down there to visit this nursery just to get Baton Rouge back in the day. I think we went down there in like '09 or 2010 just to visit them. And they're growing this one in Warren, Texas. It's going to be pretty heat tolerant
Yeah,
for us.
for
So
sure.
it is exceptionally durable. We found it to even outperform any of the other coral barks. But again, most of the coral barks are pretty heat tolerant. But it's that upper scale of the most durable.
Yeah, and then you get that added bonus feature there in winter, and you have that beautiful red twig out there in your garden,
Right.
contrasting with everything else. So, sometimes maples you think of maybe just their spring or fall, but this
Hmm.
gives you that extra feature on that. And then just going on down the list here, I love the structure of this plant.
Hmm.
I think it makes some of the most interesting shapes, and just the way it grows and this amazing habit that it has. We have Shishigashira.
Oh man, some of these, like,
Yeah,
it's hard to pick just 5.
right.
Obviously, this list isn't the definitive 5
No,
only you can
not at
grow
all.
in high heat areas, but Shishigashira has always performed exceptional for us in high heat climates. I know Tim mentions it and other things, but I had some cousins growing this one in Columbia, South Carolina. If anybody knows Columbia, South Carolina, that is a high heat area.
Oh yeah,
They had it up against a brick home and in red dirt clay there. And I mean, the brick was getting some resonating heat off that, obviously. And it just grew like a weed for him. I couldn't believe how well it was doing in full sun in Columbia, South Carolina, against a brick house. And it just performed exceptionally. Now, as Brian was mentioning too, age can be a factor. When you first get trees in the ground,
yeah,
they're not going to be as durable as they are once they're established. So as they get those roots established in, there's some inherent durability the second year that the first year just doesn't have. But Shishigashira is, gosh, it's tough as nails. And it's also one I like to point out that is an excellent fall performer, even in high heat zones.
for
So I've
sure.
seen this one even in areas where people kind of go, we don't really get a lot of fall color here, but this one is always pretty consistent.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to its foliage. It's so tough that by the time you get through summer, a lot of those other maples might be a little damaged and show some wear and tear
Right.
from those summer months. But the Shishigashira, I mean, it's still just looking rock solid. So that's what kind of gives it that edge when it going into fall
Oh,
is you
yeah.
still have all of that really nice pristine foliage on there that goes into its fall color. I love that about it. And I think too, even with putting it in more sun and higher heat, like to me, it was like, give me some more of that. Like I think
Oh,
it
yeah.
it was more robust, more full looking. It just really felt like that gave it a little something extra, just giving it a little more sun.
Oh yeah, I mean it's always popular for bonsai because you can just beat it up. I mean it's a tough one. It does well in pretty much every setting. That's why it's been around since the 1700s.
Yeah.
But Shishikashira, you'll see it sometimes sold as lion's head. So if you know it as lion's head, that's the same plant. Uh, Got to be on our list for green uprights. Now next here, Acer palmatum Osakazuki. This is one of our first large leaf Amoenums to make the list. Classic for the fall color. I mean, it's another one that performs even in areas that say we kind of get crummy fall color.
Right.
It tends to be one of the better reds.
Oh yeah,
in the fall.
and we actually just got a chance to see a really nice one down in Charlotte when we were visiting the Maple Walk garden there. Just absolutely beautiful. I mean, I love just the shape it creates out there. Nice, sturdy, upright tree, and the fall color on that. Just any spot you put it in, it's just going to light it up. I grew this one in Oklahoma as well, and it was part of my full sun garden. Definitely one of the cultivars that I'd recommend for that. It seemed to tolerate that very well. I love its spring color too. It's kind of underrated for its spring color.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's definitely one that I think can work in so many different gardens. I think it's a crucial cultivar when we're talking about high heat.
Oh yeah, I mean it's going to be a lush green again in the spring, and then reaching some of the pinnacles for red fall color you can reach with a Japanese maple. And I had to put it on the list here because I've seen it doing well in extreme sun conditions in Dallas, Fort Worth, and just outperforming other plants. I mean, it looked excellent. And again, more established plants are going to look better than underestablished plants, but it's one that tends to be on that upper scale always.
And then next on the list, I think we were both like writing at the same time. It's like, what's your number one green upright? It's got to be Cereus. I mean,
People think it's going to be delicate because it's a lace leaf,
Right.
and so a lot of people have this ingrained thought that lace leaves are wimps or
Yeah.
they're going to be more delicate. And gosh, Cereus is anything but that. I mean, it's going to put on over 1.5 foot of growth a year. The name means blue green dragons, and we never really understood that because we told people it works great in sun. So if you're planting it in sun, it's going to be like chartreuse on the new growth. As the tree ages and it shades out some of that older growth, you
Mhm.
kind of get some more of that emeraldy bluish. I mean, not necessarily blue. I mean, there's no blue Japanese maple, but you get more of that blue green kind of color in it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and what I really love about the vigor on this plant is just amazing. So you don't have to wait so long to get a nice, good looking tree, and and also can provide some shade for some other plants around it. That's a great feature that this can give you. Planting it out in the sun, and then as it starts to get established, you've got some shade that you can start planting other things around it. It's going to give it some extra protection out there in the sun, so you can kind of move some of those more delicate plants out there.
Oh, that's an
because of
excellent
its
point.
presence.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I mean, Cereus is going to allow people to grow hostas and things they couldn't necessarily grow. I mean, it's gonna shade out your garden. It's going to put on over 1 to 1.5 feet. I mean, it's very regularly 1.5 foot of growth a year, so it's often a tree that can provide shade for your smaller Japanese maples as well, and really provide a little bit of shade there in the landscape. So, hey, let's move on to some of our favorite dwarf picks. Now, we didn't really classify these by color. We just kind of picked some very heat tolerant
Yeah.
dwarfs. But I think that's an interesting category for Japanese maples. Now, we have a whole separate category for lace leaves, but we'll talk about some of our favorite smaller style Japanese maples. And these also are always excellent for containers. So we mentioned the containers in the high heat areas, making sure your pots aren't too hot or having too much reflective heat on those. Sometimes people put a pot by the pool and they're not necessarily in the highest heat zone, but they don't know why their tree's all crispy, but it's getting all reflective heat all day, or a container in front of like a glass, office building, and it's getting a lot of indirect light.
Right.
So we got to be cautious of that. But these are some great candidates for container gardening or in the ground.
Yeah. Well, we say it a lot. Gardens are kind of shrinking as the world fills up with people and houses and everything else. So there's less and less land, and yards get smaller. And so you're always looking for different types of plants that you can fit into a smaller space. And this is like the perfect example of what I'm kind of going through right now. Is
Right.
I didn't grow as many dwarfs in Oklahoma because I had all this room, but now I'm like, oh man, I need to find some nice dwarfs.
And again, these are just some of our favorites. It's not a definitive list by any means, but Hime Sojo has done very well for us. It's tested really well in any of
Yeah.
the higher heat climates we've sent it to. It is a true dwarf Hime form. So if you like that dwarf compact density, Hime Sojo basically means dark red princess or dark red dwarf. It's a compact, dense habit. great for container gardening, but it's also going to provide some of the smallest deep red foliage.
I mean, and hold its color, right? I mean, like honestly, we go through the greenhouses and you get in late summer and everything's kind of bleached out or faded colors. And you look over and you'll see Hime Shoujo is like bright red. The whole set right there. And
Right.
this spot is just bright glowing red.
We
So
keep our poly on all year,
yeah,
so we kind of high heat test here as
right.
well. We kind of know what holds color and some of your extreme changes because we keep that poly on year round. Some of those houses are pretty toasty.
Yeah, I love that about that cultivar, and then moving on here, Kiyohime is kind of the opposite of that, which is that beautiful green color with a nice purple border on that. We saw one just the other day that just absolutely
Oh,
stunning. I can't wait to go back and see that in the spring because I think
right.
it's just going to be,
Shout out to Tom Nunnenkamp. We just shot at Maple Walk in
yeah,
Charlotte, so we've got a lot of those beautiful plants in our mind. And
yeah,
he has
absolutely.
an amazing form of Kiyohime there. Really nice compact dwarf that's going to give you some good width, but not a lot of height. I mean, typically, unless you're staking this one up or putting it on a high graft, it's going to be 3 to 4 feet. So a more smaller overall footprint for height. Now they can get a little bit more width with age, but it's going to be a beautiful compact dwarf. Brian mentioned that purple border. It's going to have a neon purple border with kind of a yellowish green eye in the spring. So an excellent candidate for high heat, uh, full exposures. I've seen Kiyohime and Murasaki Kiyohime. I'll kind of throw that one in there as a subcategory at Dr. Bill Shell's garden in Alabama in full sun, just not skipping a beat. Old mature specimens, and they looked amazing. I know Harold Johnson was growing Kiyohime there very early on, and it was one of his top picks for just like tough as nails, heavy exposure.
Right. Yeah, great plant. And then I guess moving on here, we can jump on to Kamigata.
Oh man, one of JD Veritrees he put out there. Veritrees was one of the ones that helped make this popular. He listed it as great for rock gardens. So if you know you're putting
Yeah.
in a rock garden, it's pretty tough. One thing I actually always try to mention in the other section is be careful with rocks because rocks can add too much reflective heat. I've had people in areas like Memphis put rocks around a tree, and while it's beautiful river rock, it might not necessarily be cooling once it keeps
Yeah.
that
Right.
residual heat in the rock. But Veritrees list Kamigata is great for rock gardens. It's tough. It's a compact dwarf with a lot of interest to it. I love how each little leaf almost looks like a little chicken foot. Like it's got like an elongate, almost looks like a little hand or something there on each little individual leaf. But it's tough.
Yeah, absolutely.
So next up here on our list for these heat tolerant dwarfs, we've listed Acer palmatum Shana. Now Shana is another one from Red Maple Nurseries. It's named after Billy Short's daughter by Dick Wolf. And it's another one of those brooms. I didn't put a ton of brooms on this list, but brooms tend to be at the peak for heat performance. They all tend to do very well in high heat zones for us. Shana is a really nice compact dwarf red, and I think it's just a great plant for high heat zones. It tends to hold the color well. I know I've personally seen Dr. Creech growing this one down at Stephen F. Austin. He has a mass planting of these, and they get great fall color down there, but they go through the season and look really, I mean, they look great at the end of the year.
Yeah.
That's really the judge, right?
Yeah, I really love the witch's broom cultivars. I think they bring such a unique shape and texture to the garden. I love how compact they are. You can fit them in a lot of different spaces in your garden. I mean, everybody's trying to find this little nook that you need one more little maple in and a little splash of color. I think Shana is just absolutely perfect for that. And then, moving on here, I think probably one that you say more than more times than not that is your absolute favorite, and then it's relatives and family.
Right.
We have Makawa Yatsubusa.
So all you Macau fans can breathe now. There's no
Yes.
riot, no reason to rush us. We got it on the list. Macau was always popular for good reason. It's tight, shingled layering. It's a compact form. It kind of makes that bonsai-esque look there in the landscape. It's tough as nails. I mean, it really is one of those plants it's got everything going for it. When we ask nurserymen, what's your favorite plant? It's the most frequently brought up plant. It's one of our top selling plants here at Mr. Maple.
Yeah.
And whenever we did the Maple Side Tree of the Year, we decided to come up with that. It won the first year by a lot. And so it was everybody's most favorite tree. And it's got so many good traits for it. I mean, the main thing why people love this one, that tight shingled layering. I mean, it has that wow factor. It kind of looks like exotic and interesting at the same time, but it is tough. I mean, it's durable.
For sure. Yeah, it has a texture that you just don't see in very many plants. I think that's really what like catches your eye with it, that really tightly layered shingling layers of those leaves, and then its overall form. It just gives this super interesting form to it. Kind of has that bonsai esque look to it. I mean, even no matter what size it is,
Right.
even when they're young, you're like, wow, look at that. I mean, they always have this interesting shape. I love the way it just performs out there, especially in a high heat area. I mean, that's what our topic is today. I mean, it's probably one of the most bulletproof. I mean, you could give it just about all you got, and it's going to handle it.
Oh, I've seen this one in Dallas Fort Worth again in high
Yeah,
heat exposures, looking awesome. And it's another one of those plants that performs very well for fall color, even in areas where people say, I don't think we get a lot of good fall color. It tends to be a good one for that.
absolutely.
So moving along here, we'll do a category. A lot of you are going to ask about. This is most people's entryway into Japanese maples. If not a red upright, then a red lace leaf. So our most popular category for plants is often red lace leaves. Like it's normally people's entryway into maples. Like that's what people think of when they don't know anything about Japanese maples, but they've seen it. They go, "Do you grow those red weepy ones that look like this?" And they kind of look like bonsai trees. And like that's exactly what most people think of. But there's some excellent heat tolerant plants in this category as well.
Yeah, and I think our first one on the list is like the perfect example of that. People when people are just starting to like, you have one of those red dragons.
Right.
Like I mean, it's just an amazing name, right? Red dragon.
There's something to be said about a name people can
Absolutely.
remember.
I mean, and this is just a great classic red weeping lace leaf. Definitely one that you see a lot of demand for.
Hmm.
Just like you said, the combination of the name and then just its overall shape, a nice dwarf size as
Hmm.
well. Just a great plant overall.
Great performer in high heat areas. Another one by Dick Wolf Nursery there, Red Maple Nurseries. Red Dragon, it's highly sought after for so many reasons. Holds its red really late in the season. Typically a 4x5 in that 10-year period. We always try to give a time frame for sizes, but a lower, smaller overall plant. It's one of the smaller of the high heat red lace leaves we have here on the list, which makes it an excellent one. So many people are growing red lace leaves, and there's definitely some to avoid for high heat sun exposures. But this is one that tends to do pretty well in full sun and keep that foliage looking really nice, and then also provide you with that really bright kind of fire engine red. Or, well, I would say more of a fiery red fall color than most reds. It's a really picked up nice fall color, and it's an all around durable plant. I mean, for what most people are looking for a red lace leaf in a high heat environment, it's going to give them everything they're looking for.
Yeah, and I mean the same could be said about the next one here. I mean, Orangiola is it's one of those, like, I don't know what it is that I've never have actually added this one to my collection.
Oh wow.
And it's like the one that just always,
Maybe once you have that one, you're finished complete.
yeah,
The
no, it's like
collection's
I
complete.
avoid it because then maybe I think, well, if I have that one, then I'm done, and I don't want to be done. So I just get, I just always have it as well. I got to get an Orangiola, so I'm not done yet. So
It's always at the top of the list for performance. Orangiola, I joke that it's the Dr. Pepper color because it's got 32 flavors in it. It's got a little bit of every color
it
red. When it
does.
first leaves out, it's got like so many different nuanced colors, and it's not just a one color deep red. Now it goes through some orangier stages. This one, midsummer, I think is its most interesting
For
stage.
sure.
You get greener, older growth, but then you kind of get orange and pink new growth flushes over top of that. It kind of gives it a little bit something. Uh, I think that's probably its most defined stage to me. And then the falls can range from oranges to just, I mean, I've almost had it be fuchsia some year. It's really interesting fall colors. It was one that has been through the test of time. It won the Royal Horticultural Award of Merit, I know. It also won the Maple Side Tree of the Year. And it's one that I've seen in so many different environments. I used to do a show down in Augusta, and this one would be one I would look at every year there in midsummer in high heat conditions, and it just looked amazing.
Yeah.
It's one that's going to be super durable for you.
And next on our list is one of your dad's favorite plants, if I understand that
Right.
correctly. So tell us
Yeah.
more about that.
Any of the ones Dad was growing back in the day, we always list those. It's funny. We kind of have a special place for those. Inaba Shidari is an excellent red for high heat environments. Now, it does green up a little bit late summer in high heat environments. I always let people know that, but it's so tough. This one can handle a lot. It's going to leaf out a bold red, go to a really bright scarlet red in the fall, and it's going to give you the like 5x5 cascading umbrella, the
Yeah.
perfect shape, a little bit more low and spreading, and just a really excellent candidate for a container garden or in the ground in a higher heat location. I know I've been asked several times by different magazines for a perfect red lace leaf, and it's one I recommend a lot. I mean, it's still one we bring up a lot. It's one we've been growing here one of the longest at our nursery, but it's one that's always on our list for top performers. I mean, it just does well.
Yeah, absolutely. Same for me. I mean, it was one of my favorite red lace leaves there in Oklahoma. One of my wife's favorite as well. And I think what she really liked about it was that it was planted right outside the kitchen window where she could see it out in the
Nice.
yard. But it, in full sun spot there,
Hmm.
and it grew like a champ. It always looked good, even late into the year. Great fall color on it, and not too big, like you said, like a nice 5x5 shape. Didn't get too out of control for its space. Just a great, like perfect, medium sized, lace leaf for the landscape.
Yeah, it doesn't outgrow an area, but it does everything you want. Again, it's everything you want for a high heat plant. I mean, it does all that you need there, and it really it encapsulates what a lot of people think about with Japanese maples. Now, this next one on our list, Acer palmatum dissectum firefall. Now, one of the reasons we had this one on here is this is definitely one of those candidates for best color late. This is an introduction by my friend Greg Ballard. I've seen this one, gosh, in high heat conditions in the South, and that color has not ceased to impress me in August. I've always been like, wow, that's impeccable looking for late into the year.
Yeah, I mean that's one I hadn't heard of and wasn't growing, and I've heard you tell me several times. And like, man, you need the firefall is like it's a legitimate candidate for that top red lace leaf, and I'm anxious to see kind of learn more about it and see it planted out in the landscape somewhere, and we need to get a video done on that. I mean,
Oh yeah.
we've done so many videos on everything lately, and that's definitely one we need to get out there and capture. I think. But the one that we could find in just about every garden, right?
Right.
I mean, every house you drive by, or different locations, restaurants,
Mhm.
whatever, you're more than likely going to see at least what you would assume would be a Tamukiyama.
I mean, it's been around since the 1700s as well. It was
Yeah,
introduced by Kobayashi Momiji, and it stood the test of time. Tamukiyama is one of those great plants for the South. It's again another one of those candidates for best color late in the season. It's a high heat performer. I like Tamukiyama. It's a little more open often, so you can kind of see into the structure
yeah,
sometimes, and that may be part of the secret to its heat tolerance. It's not as dense, but it's an awesome one for high heat exposures and for just overall durability. I know Tom Cox said it was his favorite tree, maybe his favorite Japanese maple in his garden, and he's like, I know it's a basic pick, but it looks great every year.
right.
Every year I go out there, it looks awesome.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I guess we'll move on here to our next group. Here, we kind of decided we'd want to share some things that are a little bit outside of the box that you wouldn't really normally think of when you're thinking of heat tolerant. And so we're jumping into to a variegated group. Let's start there.
Yeah, there's some really great variegated Japanese maples. You might not necessarily think about variegation in high heat areas, but these are some high performers for us. These are some of the very best for high heat locations. We want to give you tips on everything. Now, in general, the more pink or the more white, more late day shade you want to give them. You wouldn't want to put a Hanasukasa in a high heat, full sun
Right,
exposure all day. It's a very durable plant, but you're just not going to get the best out of it.
right,
And so these are some of our higher performers for high heat zones, and I think they're going to bring a lot of drama still too. I mean, they're variegated plants that they're not missing in the flash for variegation. I think these are some of the showiest styles you could be growing, but they're also on that upper scale for durability. So we'll start out here at number 5 on our list of variegated plants. It's a classic Japanese maple, Acer palmatum higashiyama.
yeah. This is one of my favorites too. Like I always love the springtime going out and taking pictures of this. I mean, it just has such an amazing spring, performance out there. I mean, it. I really, you want to plant it up somewhere close where you can really appreciate it, and because I love getting out with the camera on this one because it just has all of this interesting veining and reticulation, variegation in it. Just a beautiful small little leaf too. It
Yeah.
has a unique texture when it's coming out. These little balls of unfurling of the
Mhm.
leaf. I love that texture on that. Just a great little plant.
I will say if you plant this one in full direct sun, it will green up a little bit for you in high heat zones. I've seen this one growing in full sun in Columbia, South Carolina, and the tree wasn't burning. It did look a little greener in that July
Yeah,
timeframe than we get here in the mountains, but it is an excellent candidate for high heat exposures. It's a classic Japanese maple for bonsai for that reason too.
yeah,
A lot of overlap with bonsai just for durability purposes. So this one's tough as nails. Higashiyama's been around for a long time. It's an older cultivar from Japan, and you kind of get that weird reticulated. It's not really like reticulated like a ghost
right.
series, but it's reticulated in its own way, and it's kind of its own category. I mean, you
Yeah,
just get
for
this
sure.
weird swirling. It's often called the popcorn maple because when it leaves out, it kind of just all comes out in these weird, kind of interesting shapes that leaf out from the leaf. And it's a showstopper. It's definitely one that's going to provide a lot of flash in a humid or high heat environment.
For sure. And then jumping into a true reticulated form, Amber Ghost.
Yeah, Talon Buckholtz has that Ghost series, and he's always told us that Amber Ghost may be the most sun tolerant of any of those. And it's you know, if you're in a heavy zone 9, definitely late day shade in a heavy zone
Yeah,
9. But you'd be surprised. I think this one has shocked some people even in, you know, Georgia, in high heat environments in Georgia, zone 8. It's been a performer in some sunlight and with very little leaf burn and excellent colors. You're going to get some very fiery colors. You can kind of fade out the reticulation in heavy sun. So again, if you can still provide these with a little bit of late day shade, you'll hold your spring color later into the summer. But gosh, it's durable as heck. You can put it in the sun and not burn up.
yeah. I mean, it goes through so many different changes in color too. That's what I really love about that cultivar. I mean, it's just constantly changing, and then the new growth over that in the summer, bright red in the fall. I mean, it's
Hmm.
just a beautiful plant, you know. And to think of it in a high heat area, I think that's really interesting that you can kind of start breaking some of those barriers that you feel like, wow, well, if it's reticulated, I got to put it in deep, heavy shade, you know.
Right.
Like, I mean, there's so many different plants that's kind of the first thought you think of is I got to tuck this way back in here. No, you can kind of push that to the outer edge and give it some sun. And I think overall, I think it performs very well. I grew that one in my garden as well in Oklahoma.
Oh, it's always popular and for good reason. So next up here, you got one you've definitely heard if you listen to our YouTube channel any, Lillian's Jewel. Now, this is one of the best examples of pink on dark red. A lot of times those can be a little unstable. Lillian's Jewel is one of the best stable plants for a pink on red variegation. If you have this in heavy sun, it's going to almost be a hot pink on dark red. If you're growing it a little bit more shade, you're going to get more like white and green in there with the
Yeah.
red. But in heavy sun, it's going to be an excellent bright pink on dark red. Now, this one can go in a good bit of sun. I would say up to zone 8A typically. This one can handle a good bit of sun. You might have even been growing that one in Oklahoma in sun.
Yeah, yeah, I did, and you know, like I said, I spoke about this earlier, and you're just kind of learning your garden and things, and not being afraid to move something. When I first got this, I thought, well, it's variegated, you know, I want to put this in some shade, so I kind of planted it in some pretty deep shade.
Hmm.
And the first year, you know, it did okay, but I just didn't get that dramatic variegation that
Right.
I, you know, it was there. It was more of that muted colors, you know, white and green, just light pinks in it. And I thought, and I think I talked to you a little bit about it, and was like, hey man, you know, what would you think if I put this out in a little bit more sun, and moved it that next year out, and when it came out in the spring, I was like, whoa! I mean, this thing just absolutely lit up, hot pink, bright red,
Hmm.
and looked beautiful all through the summer. I mean, it was
It
amazing.
shocked us. We were one of the first nurseries to ever get this one from Dell Laux Nursery. I think we actually bought the first one he ever sold. The second one ever sold was sold to our friend Richard Bomar, and he's in Simpsonville, South Carolina. And he immediately put his in a good bit of sun, and so we learned right away this one could handle an exceptional amount of sun for a variegated plant.
Yeah,
Now, this next one on the list may surprise people as well. It's another Talon Buckholtz introduction, Geisha Gone Wild. Now, this one's been a high heat performer for us. It's done very well. It can green up midsummer in a heavy sun exposure, but it's one of the more dramatic pink on dark reds as well. It's a swirling. It's a different style variegation than that Lillian's Jewel, and it's really fun. I love this one in some of the higher heat zones. I think some of that late, or I would say early summer colors, some of my favorite where you actually start to fade the red to a little bit of a light green, but you still have some pink flares in there where you're getting that light pink and green flare. That that really throws that one for me. That's one of my favorite time frames.
Absolutely, I agree. Yeah, it's fun taking pictures of the geisha gone wild out in the greenhouses. I mean, because it's like every week you can come out there and expect it to be in some different variances of color, and so it's always changing. It's always interesting, grabbing your attention, and kind of very similar in that fashion that it's always grabbing your attention. Is the next one, Benny Sheehan.
Oh man, another Harold Johnson one making the list here. Harold Johnston introduced this one down in Alabama. It's always at the top of the list, and it's been tested. I mean, it's been in Alabama for over 40 years now, and it's there's some beautiful specimens that's growing in high heat exposures. You know, dark red with that swirling. The name Benny Sheehan means purple smoke, so you're going to get that weird kind of lime green early on to dark red variegation on even a darker background. Really cool one to be growing and super tough. Again, I've seen that one in full sun at Coach Dye's place,
Yeah.
and just some remarkable specimens of that are looking, you know, excellent late into the season. Quite shockingly excellent for how much sun and how much exposure they're getting.
Yeah, that was one that I grew in my garden as well, and I grew that in full sun. And it was kind of one of those that I was like, I heard its history of being from the South, and I was like, man, this is going to be perfect for my garden, and I got excited about it. Just and its variegation is super unique. Like it
Mhm.
it gets some really interesting leaf patterns on that variegation. Every leaf looks a little bit different. It's not like uniform variegation. Very twisting on the leaves, and great fall color on that too. I There was times I would get some like interesting multicolor
Yeah.
fall color on that one. It wasn't just a one color tree in the fall, but really performed very well for me in my garden. And man, I mean, just think about what we just talked about right here. I mean, we had so many cultivars that is just absolutely uh, fit for that southern gardener out there who's
Oh
got
man.
some high heat areas. It's like, man, I wish I could grow Japanese maples. Well, you absolutely can, and
Yeah,
this is the
there's
list that shows that.
these are just some basic examples. These are by no means definitive,
Right.
but we want to encourage you to try these. I mean, these are some variegated ones to start out with if you know you're in a high heat zone because they're going to perform very well for you. Our last category here are green weepers. So we've got some green weepers that'll do pretty good for you in high heat, full exposures. The first one here on the list is one of my favorites from Japan, Rikuzen Shidari.
Yeah, I love the history behind this plant. Yeah,
It's a funny
it's
story.
absolutely amazing.
So one of our friends in Japan went to a temple pre-tsunami, and he'd asked for cuttings from the original Rikuzen Shidari and was denied. Now he ignored those requests and grafted it anyway, and it's a sad story because the tsunami did destroy the original plant. They were able to recover a lot of the temple, but the original plant was lost in that. Now my friend really enjoyed returning them a giant
Oh man.
Rikuzen Shidari, and he said, "Now you know the importance of sharing." So he was able to return that one to him. Now this one kind of breaks that mold of the Ryusen styles. It's a larger, more Amoenum style leaf. So think of this one with a leaf more like Osakazuki, intense yellow fall color. But it has been an excellent grower for us in high heat conditions. It is a true weeping Japanese maple that's probably out of the lineage of Ryusen, so really unique there right out the bat, but durability has been through the roof on this one.
Yeah, it kind of breaks all the rules, right? I mean, it's got that large leaf, but then it goes yellow. It's got that weeping habit like a Ryusin. Give it some sun and it can handle it. I mean,
Oh yeah,
it's just a great performer overall. And then, kind of leading us right into the next one here, we got Ryusin, which is one I absolutely love this
oh
cultivar.
man,
I think it forms some of the most amazing shapes when it gets out there and gets established. I grew this. I had multiples of this in my garden. That's how
right.
much I loved it. I had one in a pot. I had one out in the front yard, one in the backyard. So
Mhm.
it was like one of those that I couldn't just have one of them because each one of them, you never see two Ryusin that look the same,
Right.
right? They always have a very unique shape to it. I love that about them.
They're so malleable. You can play with the
Yeah,
shapes a good bit. Now, disclaimer: I easily could have put this as my number one
yeah,
for green lace leaf or green weepers. I did pick more lace leaf categories because I know a lot of people want to hear about lace leaves going forward. But I easily could have picked this as my number one sun tolerant, heat tolerant, durable weeper. I've seen this in full sun in the Fort Worth Botanical Garden, Dallas Botanical Garden, looking exceptional. Just the other day, we were looking at that amazing one that Tom Nunnenkamp has there in Maple Walk, and he has boulders around it. I mean, those
Yeah.
boulders are holding a ton of residual heat. It's not really skipping a beat.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of those ones that's kind of bulletproof for its durability. Tends to get about as big as you stake it. Rayson has a larger palmate style leaf, but with a weeping form. Great orangey red fall color. But you can put it out in areas where you're going to be in a full sun exposure. I mean, I guess it has some of that rigidity even from like your basic Acer palmatum, subspecies palmatum. It's got a little of that magic in there
Yeah.
where it can handle that extreme exposure. You know, Columbia, South Carolina, Alabama,
Right.
Texas. It's going to do pretty good in most areas that are are going to be high heat exposures. It's on the upper scale for sure.
Next, I mean, probably one of probably one of our most popular, I
Yeah.
would say, when it comes to green lace leaf, definitely.
Acer palmatum
Yeah.
waterfall. Now this is, you can call it Acer palmatum or Acer palmatum dissectum. Gorgeous green weeping form that's going to give you some excellent yellows to almost oranges in the fall. This is your quintessential classic, typically a 5x5 umbrella form. That's going to give you a lot of green hues in the spring. Now we could pick a ton of different lace leaves for this category.
Yeah.
We narrowed it down. We actually threw the weepers in there just to make that category a little bit different. But this one's probably the quintessential, I would say, green lace leaf for high heat areas. It's one that people know. It's like the Tamukiyama of this category.
Right.
People know it. Are used to waterfall. Very similar to Veritas. You could put those two almost together. They're a little bit different, but very similar plants, and that they can handle high heat exposures. Late day sun tends to not be a problem for these, even in heavy zone 8. Perform very well, hold their foliage very well, and they look great in the fall after all that heat exposure. I mean, even after that beating of high heat, they look pretty good.
For sure. I mean, yeah, and that orange fall color on it just is absolutely amazing. I mean, sometimes it's just so vibrant, it just grabs your eye. You're like, man, look at that. Absolutely stunning. And then next on the list we got emerald lace, which it always reminds me of like the version of Seriu that you would think of in a lace leaf weeping form.
Right. It's got a lot of Seriu similarities.
Right.
I mean, I believe Emerald Lace and Seriu to be palmatums rather than Matsumaris,
Right.
where most of the lace leaves are Matsumaris. They both have that small seed on them, which makes me. I'd love to talk to some people about that one, but exceptionally fast growing as well, but opposite shaped as Seriu. This one's
Yeah.
gonna have that blue green foliage and the same dark red to bright red fall color. And this one's not an upright. Where Seriu is going to make a tall tree, we talked about in our upright section.
Mhm.
Emerald Lace is a pretty fast growing dwarf. I mean, it's not going to put on a lot of height unless you stake it up, but it's going to put on a lot of width. It fills out, makes an area look great. It's going to provide a ton of interest there in the garden. Now, I know Ken Rogers. We interviewed him here on our channel, not on the podcast, but on the YouTube channel. And really interesting guy. He's been growing Japanese maples down there in the Auburn, Alabama area. It was one of his top picks for heat tolerance.
Oh yeah, I mean, and that's a true statement. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that's definitely a high heat area, and somewhere that you wouldn't normally think of with Japanese maples. You get down in the deep south there. I mean, it gets hot, and what that's the great thing about what we're talking about today is there's so many different cultivars.
Mhm.
And then the top of this list. Every time I see this name, the first thing I think of is the one at your parents' garden.
Everybody loves that one. It's starting to get some
cannot-
size now.
I mean, I just cannot think of Jermaine's gyration without thinking the one over there. I've never seen one quite just such the perfect shape. Just amazing shape to it. All that curling and twisting and
Mhm.
arching and mounding branches on that. Beautiful, beautiful form.
I always let people know with Jermaine's gyration, it's one you're going to need some space for.
Yeah.
It is typically a
It's
10,
big, yeah.
10 by 10 in 10 years. So
Yeah.
it's going to fill out. I did an article for Jay Sifford. We did a podcast with him, so you'll have to check that out too. But we did a article for Jay Sifford, and he was writing for Howes, and he basically asked us some of our favorite heat tolerant trees back then. And the quote that got put in there is the Mack truck of Japanese maples. And it's kind of funny. I talk about it a lot. Elizabeth Mundy got me into this one at Acres or Acres, and it's kind of that perfect, uh, instant gratification plant where
Yeah.
people don't want to wait. They want a tree that looks like it's at Longwood or the Biltmore house, and they want it right away. 10 by 10 in 10 years is about as fast as you can
Yeah.
grow a lace leaf. It makes that 100-year-old presence in a pretty quick time frame. It's a lush green throughout the spring and summer, but it's going to give you some awesome yellows to oranges in the fall. and I've found it to be exceptionally heat tolerant. I have people growing this one anywhere from Columbia to Dallas to Nashville. Several customers of mine with gorgeous specimens of this in Nashville and full sun exposures, and it really doesn't skip a beat. It kind of likes the heat. If you can water adequately to make up for that growth rate and put this one in a high heat, sunny exposure, you're going to get a big tree quick.
Yeah, that's definitely, after I saw the one over at your parents' house, I was looking at my garden at home. I was like, man, I don't know if I got room for one of those. I mean but you're right. I mean, if you're wanting something fast, that really makes a huge presence. I mean, Jermaine's gyration, that's the way to go.
So those are most of our categories. I'm going to throw an honorable mention out there for yellow. We didn't do a whole yellow category because it's pretty slim on the yellows for full sun.
Yeah.
Now for full sun exposure, summer gold's hard to beat for
Hard to
yellow.
beat that.
It is a smaller, compact yellow that can go through a good bit. I've seen that in heavy sun in Atlanta, Georgia, and late summer. Again, like Tom's rubric is, what does it look like in the fall?
Yeah.
It looked great. You're going to get some red exposures on that one in the fall. The fall colors can be bright pink to red. But I mean, as far as a yellow goes for full sun, that is a Japanese maple. It's hard to beat summer gold. That's a great choice for that splash of yellow. We don't have Tim on here today to talk yellow plants all day, so we only got one on the list.
Right.
But summer gold's a great candidate to be considering for higher heat zones. Now, we actually do, that leads me into the heat seekers. We
Right.
actually do
Oh,
some
man.
really high heat plants here. Check out our YouTube video on the heat seeker series. We actually play around with some trees that may break the rules for all these categories. And I would say each of these could probably be some of the number ones in like red uprights
Sure.
or yellows for sure. We do some Acer oleviarinum X palmatums here. It's one of our projects we're really passionate about at Mr. Maple. And these are Acer oleviarinums that are hybridized with Japanese maples to provide that more heat tolerant quality of the Acer oleviarinum from China, but some of the more ornamental traits from the Japanese maple.
Yeah, I mean, the hot blonde of that group. I mean, it's one of my favorites. I think that tree, it just makes a huge statement in the garden. That bright yellow, that amazing like pink red in the fall. I mean,
Right.
it just, and then put it anywhere and it's
Oh.
going to grow and look amazing. So you're not worried about, can this handle this spot, this
Mhm.
sun, whatever. You can put it anywhere in your garden. I love that about that plant.
These are all trees we've named here at our nursery. The other two that are kind of out there are the hot sauce and the hot tamale. Both those came through Yano, who asked us to put a name on them before putting them out there. Hot sauce maybe become one of the most quintessential upright reds because for most people it looks essentially just like a Japanese maple, but it's going to be one of the darkest red, highest heat plants you can grow. And then that Acer oleviarinum hot tamale, that one's going to provide a lot of pink interest. It's kind of a Senda Sojo-y type,
Right.
so you're going to get that spring splash, kind of an emeraldy green older color, but then with that hot pink new growth all summer on the tips. I think they bring a lot to what we can do. We're always trying to push the envelope, and I think Acer oleviarinum might be, a way that Japanese maples can even go a little bit beyond.
That's right.
Guys, I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into heat tolerant Japanese maples. We've tried to not only provide you with tips for growing them in high heat zones, but also some of our favorite Japanese maple candidates for higher heat exposures. And hey, I couldn't do the high heat zones without my Oklahoma over here. I got Brian, and it was the perfect person to bring in on this one because I know you've got the experience on that too.
Yeah, man, this has been so much fun. I've really enjoyed being in the podcast today. I say it all the time, but I just love this format. There's so much information out there that's not really accessible.
Mhm.
And you just don't. There's not a lot of places to find it. And that's one of the things I always loved about Mr. Maple and you guys, and especially one of the reasons why I wanted to come and be a part of your team is that I always felt like you guys were accessible. And I love that about it because
I appreciate
there's
that.
so much to learn. There's so much to obtain information with all of these different varieties of maples. I mean, we've provided like an extensive list. I mean, I know
Yeah, yeah.
I know it goes beyond that, but
Mhm.
if somebody was just wanting to sit down and talk about, I've got a high heat spot, I'm in this climate. I need a collection of Japanese maples. I mean, you can't go wrong with what we just talked about. I mean, we
Yeah.
covered so many different varieties, colors, shapes, and textures, and
Mhm.
variegation. I mean, it's amazing to think that these plants will grow in a high heat area. It's
Oh
awesome.
man, I think it's helpful, but it also, expanding on your experience, but also our experience of sending these out all over, but then going to some of these high heat zones and checking them out. I'm still waiting to take that vacation to Maui that we get to count as a business trip. We
Yeah,
go look at some of those maples
that's
in
right.
Maui. We keep shipping Japanese maples to Hawaii. I'm gonna have to go check them out one day and see how they're doing. But there's some Japanese maples that grow, pretty much anywhere in the United States. There's a few zones that don't work, obviously, but don't be afraid to push it for these high heat areas. And hopefully this give you some confidence in expanding what you think of for Japanese maples and kind of pushing it a little bit.
Yeah.
If you're in a heavy area, you have to be careful with salt spray in some of the high ocean areas. We've got hot blonde on the battery though in Charleston. I know a customer growing it down there, and in Bishopville, South Carolina, and some of these cultivars. I mean, I've seen them in high heat Dallas, full sun. Like
Yeah.
you're going to be shocked by how well some of these do, especially once established. So don't be afraid to grow Japanese maples in high heat areas, and hopefully this deep dive into this gives you more confidence for that. So guys, if you're enjoying this kind of content, definitely go and sub us on all of your major podcast platforms. I think we're on most of the top 10 major
Yeah.
ones, and rate us 5 stars. That helps other people find us. But we really appreciate that. And as always, join that chat if you're on YouTube. Go and find the Mr. Maple Show on YouTube. We put out a daily video every single day. So if you're only a podcast follower, you'll want to check out the Mr. Maple Show. There's 7 days a week content on that show. We premiere the videos every day at 9 a.m. The podcast video does premiere at 8 p.m. on Sundays.
Yeah, I really think what we got going on our YouTube channel is really amazing too. I think you guys, if you're listening to the podcast, definitely go over and check that out because we do a ton of variety there. I love every day is a little bit different of a show, a little bit different of a topic, different cultivars that we get into, collections. I mean, it's really, really amazing to think that we can create so much content, and I enjoy making it with you guys and putting it all together and trying to put it all together and make it look good. And Sean, man, he's been such a crucial piece
Oh yeah,
to our podcast.
Shout out to Sean Richardson of
For
Bad
sure, man.
Rabbit. He's the guy playing the guitar intros there. You can go check out Sean's top 5 Japanese maples as well. But shout out to Sean for all the good work he does making us look good and sound good on this podcast.
Absolutely. We appreciate you guys watching and listening to us today on the podcast. And we hope you guys been enjoying all of this content. And take care.
God bless.
Have a great day.